In this video, we're going to render a winter coat that's going to match back to a swatch of fabric. Plus, we're going to learn to do glossy boots. And then in the second video, you're going to finish it by doing all of your color pencil, mixed media, and ink. Alright, so far what we've done is you've chosen a fabric for a winter coat, and you went through and you found the perfect marker combination to render that fabric. At this stage now, what we're ready to do is we're ready to transfer our drawing here onto the Ben Fang paper. And then eventually what we're going to do is we're going to render it completely with markers from the back and then color pencil and ink from the front, as well as some other mixed media to render the glossy boots. The tools that you'll be needing for today's lesson is going to be the Ben Fang paper that you've already been working on to find your markers for this fabric swatch. You're going to want to have those markers plus your flesh tones and hair tone. Also during this lesson, I'm going to show you how to use some gray. So any grays that you have, so for instance I have 2, 4, and 5 right here. You'll also want to have your finished drawing that we're going to transfer to your marker paper. And of course you'll need a mechanical pencil, a detail eraser, regular eraser, and a swatch of fabric for working with your markers. And of course we'll need some more blank copy paper to keep this from bleeding through to your tabletop, or if you're working on a dark tabletop, you need to have a white background behind this. Alright, let's get started with rendering our girl with markers from the back. So far what we've done is we're taking our fashion drawing, we're putting it behind the marker paper, and then transferring here to the front using a very light mechanical pencil. It makes you really take your time and go in and get all the details super clean. A few things I want you to notice. I did not take the time to put any eyelashes or eyebrows in here because we'll get that later on. Also make sure you have her collarbone, her throat, her shoulders, and I'm showing a little hint of some cleavage here. I also lightly put in where's the bottom of her bust cup. Later on I'm going to completely erase those, but I want to know where those are at from when I'm shading with my markers. Also I've taken the time here to go and detail out the belt, but I didn't make any other little belt holes inside of here. We can do that later. Don't forget to include the skirt underneath. And then inside of here I've taken the time to come in and just lightly draw a few little strap buckles on the sides. And this is just very lightly, I'm showing what's going to eventually be some of the highlights on the boot. And then coming down and finishing up the detailing for the boot. Alright, so go ahead and take the time to do this now. Okay, so we're almost ready now to start rendering. You need to remember that we're going to color this from the back. So first things first is we need to know where is our light source here on the front of the page. Because I'm doing women's wear and this jacket here is overlapping towards her right side, I'm going to want to have a lot of shadows here on this side of the jacket. So I'm going to have my light source coming from this direction. So I'm going to draw an arrow here up by her head. As a reminder, I'll do another arrow here by her hip, and I'll do another one here down by her boots. Now let's turn our page over to the back, and also let's get some clean blank copy paper behind this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to put some marker on those highlight arrows to show where the light source is. For this first light source arrow, I'll go ahead and put it in marker using my flesh tone. And then the one that I have here at her hips, I'll do this with my lighter color marker that I'm going to use for the rendering on the jacket. And for the arrow down here near her boots, I'll use the darker of the two colors for rendering my jacket. Alright, so what I like to do is I'm going to go ahead and start from the top of my drawing and work my way all the way down to the bottom. With that said, we're going to start here with her beanie cap, and then eventually we'll move down into her face, her neck, and her hair. Back here on the front, we have our menu for what we're going to do to color our jacket. I want to review here that for doing the beanie cap, I can do it here using this pale lime color. And then for the boots, we'll do a combination of aquamarine and pale lime. Now for those of you working at home and you have different color swatches and you've come up with a different color formula for doing your particular fabric, just keep in mind that basically what I'm doing is I have my combination that matches back to my fabric. I'm going to use the lighter version of that for her hat and the darker version of that for her boots and her skirt and her belt. Alright, let's get started, and we're going to come up here and color in the beanie, and we're going to use the lighter version of your color combination. So in my instance, I'm going to use the pale lime here for her beanie, and then for her face and skin tone, I'll do light sand mixing with pink, and then for her hair, I'll be using craft brown. Okay, so for the beanie, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and just get a nice one even wash of the same color all the way through. And then while it's still semi-wet, semi-dry, I'm going to come in here and start throwing in some of my cast shadows and midtones. Now because it's a very light color, I need to stop for a minute and just let it dry a little bit, so then I can come in and start stacking some more color on top. Now here's my light source, so I want to make sure I'm starting over here in the shadow areas. Now as I'm doing these shadow areas, I'm also following the curvature of her hat. And then as it dries some more, I want to come in and just put some little dots here and there. And those are basically shadows in between all of the little wails and weaves from this knit beanie. And then what I need to do is let this get completely bone dry, and I can come in and I can stack some more deeper shadows. So here I'm laying down just a little bit of green inside of her irises. And then I want to let this dry completely, and I'll come back and I'll do her skin tone. Now while I'm waiting for the green to dry on her irises, I'm going to go ahead and skip down below her chin and get her whole neck and chest area. So I'll come in here and I'll start laying down a base layer of my flesh tone. And then I want to make sure to mix in a little bit of a pinkish color to give this a natural skin look, having that pink underneath there. And I'm doing this on the highlight side, so the same side where the arrow is. Then while it's still a little bit wet, semi-dry, I want to come in and start getting my midtones by putting some cast shadows underneath her chin, behind her neck, along her collarbone, and then down following along the collar of her jacket. I'm going to go ahead and let this get totally, completely bone dry before I come back in and add some hard cast shadows and before I start to color her face. Now while we're letting this neck area get completely dry before we go back and do her face, let's go ahead and come down here and start coloring in her hand that's on top of the jacket. Here on her hand, we want to lay down just a basic single layer coat all the way through, making sure that you're not making the fingers extra long or too wide because of the marker. And then we'll come in and we'll also touch this a little bit with some pink anywhere where the sunlight would be hitting the tops of your hands. And then while it's still semi-dry, semi-wet, I'm going to come in and start adding some midtones in my cast shadow areas. So underneath her palm, where her hand goes into her jacket, and then separating out the fingers by giving them little cast shadows. Alright, let's let this dry completely before we come back in and do a little more detailed work with some cast shadows, and we can go back up and finish her face. So here I'll come in and I'll lay down a base layer for her skin. And I'm making sure to avoid her eye color, but I'm not worried about the whites of her eyes. I can come back and get that later with color pencil and make it white again. And then while it's still wet, I want to quickly come back in here and start getting a little bit of pink on her cheeks as well as her lips. Now while this is semi-wet, semi-dry, I want to come in, I want to make it darker all in her eye socket area and start doing some shaping here for her nose. And then of course on the shaded side of her face we can come in and make the jawline a little bit darker and a little bit of a shadow underneath her lower lip. Now at this point I'm going to let this get completely dry, and then later on I'll come back and I'll do some cast shadows with a little bit more of my skin tone. Now while her face is still just a little bit wet, I'm going to go ahead and start doing my hair tones. Basically I'm going to start getting the swoops right in front of her face, and then of course following behind her neck. Now while it's semi-wet, semi-dry, I want to come back in and get some of my midtones. At this stage, her neck is bone dry, so I'm going to come in here and get some of my hard cast shadows. Again, remember that the light source is over here, so all of your cast shadows will be over here. I'll come back in and get some hard cast shadows for her hands. And then now that her face is completely dry, I'll come in and just get a few more cast shadows to emphasize her nose, the depth in her eyes, and a little bit down on her jawline and underneath her bottom lip. While the beanie now is also completely dry, I'm going to come in here and just get a little bit more of the cable knit that's in her beanie cap by just showing shadows. So I'm just doing little dots and I'm following the same shaping as her head. And then also I'm going to throw just a few more cast shadows in the little furry ball at the top of her head. Now that I'm taking a look at this from the front, I'm kind of wishing that I got a little more pink stain on her lips. But I know now if I were to come back and add this while it's bone dry, it'll get too stark of an edge and I don't want that. So what I'll do is later on when we move to color pencil, I'll come in here and I'll color this in a little more with my color pencils and it'll look like a little something like that. Alright, at this point now we're ready to start coloring in her jacket, moving all the way down to the bottom hem. How we're going to approach this is two things. Number one, we're just going to do puzzle pieces as we go, making sure that none of the puzzle pieces touch because we don't want the colors to bleed together. Also, when you do this in puzzle pieces, it'll give you nice, sharp, crisp edges wherever there's seams and folds. The second thing we need to do is we need to do our formula. So we're going to do pale lime first and aquamarine second. just to get this first base layer. So for now, that's what we're working on. But while the base layer is wet, we also need to go back and hit it again with some more aquamarine to start getting your midtones. Alright, so let's turn this paper over and I'll show you how to do that now. Now when I come in here and start coloring this jacket, I want to be able to move my paper around. So the first thing I want to do is clear off all of my tools except for the 2 pens that I need for this segment. Alright, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start by laying down my lighter color on her collar. And then while it's still wet, I need to come in and hit this with my darker color. Now also what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up to separate puzzle pieces so the colors don't bleed into each other. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to do the lapel again with my lighter color first, and then while it's still wet, I'll hit it with my darker color. Now at this point, I can go back up to the first collar that I started coloring, and I can come in here while it's semi-dry, semi-wet, and I'm going to hit it with some mid-tones. And pretty much almost the whole collar is going to be a little bit darker because my light source is on the opposite side of the page. At one point my camera stopped recording and I started coloring the sleeve, and let's continue with that now. So I got the base layer on this lapel here. While the sleeve is semi-dry, semi-wet, I want to come here, just get a little separation from the jacket that's in front of it, plus a couple wrinkles, a little bit of a shadow here at the elbow. And then I can get some midtones here on this lapel as well. And then I'm going to come back here and I'm going to get this upper collar. I just want to establish my single base layer. Now if you'll notice, I'm not getting this area here underneath the collar roll going behind her neck because I want to get those nice and dark. And for this collar right here, I'm going to go ahead and get my midtones while it's semi-wet, semi-dry. And while all of this is drying, I'll skip over here to this arm now. Now what I'll do to get this sleeve is I'm going to rotate this so my hand isn't touching that sleeve right there. So again, I'm just establishing my base layer, which is the 2 colors down once. And then I'll come in and I'll start to get my midtones while it's semi-dry, semi-wet. Again, this is all along the shadow side of her jacket. So I'll just get this whole edge, plus what's going on at her elbow, the bottom edge here, and going inside the cuff of her sleeve. There's also a little bit of a shadow here from the belt that's sticking out. Now, the area I was talking about that's going behind her neck, I wanted this to be really dark. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip-flop my menu. So I'm going to do the darker marker first and the lighter marker second. And that's going to help make that look really dark going behind her neck. Now at this point I'm ready to start working on the main jacket. I just want to always keep in mind that this side of her jacket is in the light area, this side of the jacket's in the dark area. So let's go ahead and do the lighter side first. And make sure you avoid the buttons because we're going to color those nice and dark later. So again, I'm getting this wet back up in here where I first started, so it's not getting too dry. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to hit this with my second color just to get our base layer. Again, I'm avoiding the buttons. I want to keep those nice and clean and white. And I'm also avoiding the belt and the belt buckle. I'm noticing a little bit of some brush strokes, so I'm going to come in here with my lighter marker and just get this wet. Now, while this is drying a little bit, eventually I want to come in and emphasize underneath her bust and underneath this collar. Alright, so I'm going to test it out here. I'm going to get my midtones underneath this collar. The shadow side of her buttons. A little bit of some midtones here going behind her belt. There's some wrinkles on her waist. And then just a little emphasis right here where her bust is. Now while that's drying, I'll come over here and we'll get this side of the jacket. Now again, here's the light source coming this way. So we're going to have cast shadows from the jacket overlap, down at the belt, down at her waist, underneath her bust, as well as the jacket lapel, the collar, and basically this whole area here is in the shade. Now while this is all drying, let's take a look at this from the front. So here from the front, we can see we're establishing our base layer. Again, this is the darker version of your fabric. So for instance, we were saying the inside of these swirls had the darkest areas. That's what we're matching back to. Later on, we're going to be adding color pencil here to the front to get all of our rich highlights and pop colors that will match back to the fabric tones as well. Now at this point, we're ready to come down here and finish getting both sides of the jacket coming down. Be really careful to skip everything about the belt. Leave these buttons white like we did up here. And don't worry about the skirt and the leg and the back side of the jacket in this area. We'll get to that a little bit later. Now because it's such a large area, it's difficult to do this without getting brush strokes, especially because we're also mixing two different colors for our base layer. So what you want to do is your brush strokes should be following the direction that the jacket is traveling. So even if you do get a few brush strokes, it still looks like shadows and stuff on her hips. Now while this is semi-wet, semi-dry, I'm going to come in here and start getting a few of my shadows. Keeping in mind we don't want to get too crazy because this is the light side of the jacket. So I'm emphasizing underneath her belt, the little edge for her pocket, each cast shadow from the button, down in this area where the fabric is folding over, and back in here where it's rolling behind her leg. Okay, so what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to come in and color the far side of her jacket that's away from the light source. And I'm going to lay down my light color up in this area here. It's a little bit technical by her belt and between her fingers. And while it's still wet, I'll also come back and I'll hit it with my darker color. But I immediately need to switch back to my lighter color and pick up right from where I left off, making sure to not let this get dry. And keep switching between my colors. Now because it's a really large area, I'm going to come down here and get all of this wet as fast as possible and then come back and hit it again with my darker color. And for such a large area like this, I'll probably get a few brush strokes. So I'm making sure that my brush strokes are flowing in the same direction of the jacket. So if you do see some brush strokes, it won't look bad because it has that same flow that the jacket has. Now you'll notice while you're working on the area all in between her fingers, it's incredibly difficult to do this perfectly. But keep in mind that what we're going to do is from the front of your drawing, you're still going to be able to come back in and hit those areas with some color pencil and your black ink and redefine them. All right, let's take a look at this here from the front. So far we've colored her beanie, face, hair, her skin on her neck, and then we got all of the basic single layer plus midtones here for the jacket. We're also making sure to leave the buttons white as well as leaving the belt white. Down in this area, if you got any marker accidentally onto her hand color, it's okay. We'll fix that later with some colored pencils. Down into this area, so we have a little bit of some shadows here in the folds of her jacket and separating the two layers. What we're going to do is we're going to go back once this is completely bone dry and we're going to hit it a third time, getting some nice crisp shadows. Now the next thing we want to work on is here we have a line for the hem of her skirt, and then this is her leg coming down, and eventually we'll do some fishnet knee highs, and then eventually we'll move into doing the boots. Now for this skirt, what I want to do is like a charcoal gray color to match back to her fishnets. Let's go ahead and find a really cool charcoal gray color that we like. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to lay down some swatches of cool gray number 2, 4, 5, also basic gray 5, and cool gray number 7. Okay, so taking a closer look at these, we have cool gray number 2, 4, 5, this is basic gray, and cool gray number 7. Now that basic gray has a little bit of a greenish tone to it. That might actually work really well with our colorway because our colorway has kind of a bluish greenish tone to it. Me personally though, I don't like any kind of a greenish gray color, so I'm going to shy away from that. And I'm going to stick with this cool gray number 5. You can see here if we moved all the way down to cool gray number 7, this almost looks like a base color for something that's black. And that's actually what I would use for black, because this cool gray number 7, you can also stack it and make this darker and darker in the shadows. So if I want my skirt to be a charcoal gray as well as her fishnets, then what I'll do is I'll use number 5 and number 2. Now if we take a look at her skirt here, it's just a little tiny triangle and there's not much room for showing like cast shadows and stuff, but we're going to go ahead and try just a little bit of a cast shadow when we're coloring this. So let's come over here to the back of the paper. Now if you're doing this project and you don't have cool grays and you wanted to just leave the skirt so it's matching back to the jacket, what you can do is take your menu that you have for your jacket color. So for instance, I'm doing the light one first, the dark one second, and just reverse it. So color this using the dark one first and then the lighter one second, and the skirt will have a different value from the jacket itself. For me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put down a base layer of cool gray number 2, and then I'll come back and I'll hit it with my number 5, starting in the shadows, and I'll let that just slightly bleed out until the cool gray number 2, and then I want to let this get semi-dry, and I'll come back and throw a little more mid-tone here in the shadow side. Now watch me first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to color her legs, and down here there's a little bit of a leg showing through. with also the fishnets on top. But the band going around her legs, I don't want to have flesh tone on that because I want to make it a nice crisp gray color. So for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my flesh tone plus the pink ready to go, as well as my cool gray number 2 with all of these with the caps off so I can do this all at the same time. So I'm going to color her leg down to the top of her knee highs. I want to quickly come in here and get a little bit of some red where her knee is, maybe the inside of her thigh a little bit. Again, this is the light side of her body. Then I'm going to skip the top part of the knee highs, and I'm going to go down to this last little bit where it's going to be fishnets going down into the boot. And I'm going to hit it with my flesh tone, and I'm going to turn around, and while it's wet, I'm going to put my cool gray number 2 on there. Now the upper leg is semi-dry. I need to throw my mid-tone shadows here underneath her jacket, as well as the skirt hem, and then underneath her kneecap. Down here, this is semi-dry. I'm going to use my flesh tone to throw in some shadows, and I'm going to hit this again with my cool gray number 2 also to start showing some of the shadows. And then I'll let this dry and I'll move on to the next leg here. Now that the legs have dried completely, I'm going to take my cool gray number 5 and I want to get these tops of the knee highs. Now I know that this marker is notorious for wanting to bleed a lot, so I'm going to be careful that as I'm going through and doing this, I back off just a little bit from my pencil line because I know it'll bleed into that. And then what I'll do is I'll come in with my number 2. And these are going to be fishnets. So what I want to do is with my marker, I can draw what will eventually be the shadows from the fishnets. So I'm drawing them with a slight curve because it's going around the leg. And then also at a bias angle because that's how a fishnet works. It's going down like diamond shapes. Now you can start to see the shadow and the texture for the fishnets. Now something else that we need to do is in between her leg and the jacket here, we should be able to see the inside of the jacket. Now normally if you have a fully lined jacket, this would actually be a view of the lining of the jacket. But we're not concerned about the lining in this sense of doing a rendering. We just want to show that this is the backside of the jacket. So similar to what we did here going behind her neck, we flip-flopped our formula. So we did the darker color first, the lighter color second. That's what we're going to do for this area right here. Now the same formula for doing the darker one first and the lighter one second is exactly what I'm going to do for her belt and her buttons. So let's go ahead and do that now. We want to make sure also to avoid the belt buckle. If we take a look here at the front, the belt buckle itself is metal, so we want to avoid that as much as possible. And then what we're going to do is later on, we're going to come in here and we're going to make it look like it's silver. Okay, so come over to the back side of the paper. What we're going to do is we're going to use the darker of our two colors, and we're going to lay that down first so it goes through the paper first, and then I'm doing my lighter color on top of that to give it a little bit of green. Here I'm going to come in, I'm going to hit my belt, again with the darker color, and then the lighter color second. And I'm working through this in small puzzle pieces so I can keep it nice and wet as I'm mixing the two colors, and I'm not worried about any brush strokes. Alright, so let's take a look at it now from the front. So you'll be able to see now that the buttons look darker and the belt looks darker, as well as this area back here behind her legs. And so basically when you buy a belt to go back and match to your fabric, of course you're not going to find the perfect matching belt. So having a belt here that's a close match actually looks more realistic. The same exact formula that we're doing here to make these areas darker, we're going to use this on the boots as well. Okay, so the next part here is we're going to start coloring for these boots. When we're doing this, you need to know what the end result is before you start so you can do this correctly. Basically, when we look at the end result here, the boots are going to be really dark on one side and light on the other side. And then we're also going to have this really stark pure white and pure black right up against each other, which will give it that glossy effect. So you can see here when I did my demo, I did like a practice version of it here, and then we did some on the boot itself. Now for the coloring part, right now what we're looking for is we want to have the dark side of the boot and the light side of the boot so these look like cylinders. Later on we'll come in and we'll get these really crisp white highlights. So watch me first, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue with the same menu where I'm going to do my darker color first and my lighter color second to get the base color of the boots. But I also want to make sure I'm leaving some really highlight areas out here in the light side of the boot. Alright, so watch me do this first. What I'm going to do is I'm using my darker marker here, starting from the dark side of the shoe. And then as I come out onto the light side, I'm going to stop and I'm going to switch to my lighter marker, and I want to mix these two colors. But also with the lighter marker, I'm going to come all the way out to the light edge of the shoe. This is going to give it that glossy look. And then I need to do a quick swipe of dark color here to make it look like a cylinder. And I'll also finish coming down into the top side of her shoe. Now I want to mix my lighter color so I have that blue-green look to it. Now let's do this again on the next shoe. So again, I'm going to start with my darker marker on the dark side of the boot. And I'm going to come all the way out to where I have my light side of the boot has a glossy hit. So I'm going to switch to my lighter marker, and now I'm going to finish coloring all the way across the whole boot, including the dark side. I also need to come in here and get just a little outside edge in the light area to make it look like a cylinder. And then I'll also finish coming down in here and finishing the top of the boot. What I want to do here is this little spot on her shoe is where you can see the wood. So in order to make it look wooden, I'm going to use my flesh tone and I'm going to mix that with my hair color and just give it a nice wood look. I'm going to come over here and work on this shoe now while I'm letting that one dry completely. I want to finish getting the bottom of her shoes, and I'm going to leave just a little space where that seam is. And it's going to act as a highlight for later when we make these look glossy. So I'm just leaving some white areas right where the seam is on the boot. Alright, and I'll come over and do the same thing on this boot now as well. So again, you can see where I'm leaving some white on the seam. And then we got to put some color here on the outside edge of the stiletto heel. Now these little straps here on her boots, I want them to really stand out and be different. You could almost make them a color, so for instance like red or gray or black. Something that I'm going to do is I'm going to use my darker tone all by itself, and hopefully that'll help it to stand out and have a very different color. Alright, let's take a look at these now here from the front. So eventually you can see what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and start adding some texture with color pencils, and then I'll add my glossy highlights, and then we'll finish with inking. But for now you can get a sense of, here's my light source, this is the light side of the glossy boots, this is the dark side of the glossy boots. And then we have a little bit of some separation between the seam work on the shoes, and then we're showing just that little bit of brown right here on the inside edge of her heel. Now that everything on her jacket is completely bone dry, what I want to do is, with my darker tone, I'm going to come in and I'm going to hit some nice crisp hard cast shadows. So let's turn our paper over to the back side and then follow along and do these shadows with me now. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have both of these open because I'm a little bit worried about doing cast shadows with this aquamarine by itself, because I feel like it's so blue that this might start to change the color of my jacket. And at some point I might need to come back and touch it up with a little more green. So I'm going to just have both of these ready as we do this. Now also the light source is here on the right side of the paper because we have it flipped over. So for the most part, we're working on shadows here on this side of the jacket, and then as we travel to this side, it's less and less. Let's do some easy ones right now. So this collar right here, I want it to pop up off the page. So I'm going to get some nice crisp shadows underneath those collars. Also, there's the extension for her jacket. So let's go ahead and get a nice crisp shadow for that extension, leading down into the belt here. And we can just emphasize a few wrinkles on the side of her jacket here, and just a tiny bit underneath her bust. For this sleeve, we could do a nice crisp shadow here under her armpit. We can emphasize a few little wrinkles here, her elbow, and up here at the seam where her shirt sleeve, and up here at the seam where her jacket sleeve is separate from the main body. Down here where her wrist is going into the jacket, I want to make this nice and dark. Continuing along this side of the jacket, underneath her hand, there should be some distinct shadows. Be careful to not mess up all the work you did on her fingers. There's also the extension of the jacket and a shadow from the belt. And here, if I feel it's getting a little bit dark, I can come in with my light color and just get some green back inside of that blue. Down here where we can see her hip is popping out and the jacket here is scooping away, we can come in and start to emphasize that a little bit more. And again, I just want to mix a little bit of my light tone on here so it doesn't get too blue looking. Now let's come over to the light side of her jacket. I already have a pretty crisp shadow for her collars, so I don't want to mess that up. I'll do a little bit of a shadow under each button, a little bit of a shadow from this belt. Over here where we have a side seam pocket, I'm going to just emphasize that seam one more time. Down in here we have where the jacket is flopping outwards. I want to come in and just emphasize that a little bit more. And again, I don't want it to get too blue, so I'm going to mix in some of my light green color. Right here, her hip is popping out into the light, but there's this little fold behind. I'm going to just emphasize that a titch more. And then this arm right here, it's on the light side, but we want to separate it out from the jacket, so I'm going to just emphasize some shadows on the sleeve that's going behind the jacket, and a couple little creases here at the elbow. And I'll put just a little bit of some green back in that color. Now when I turn this over and I look at the belt, I want the belt to look and feel a little more blue because I want it to stand up off the jacket. So my light source is on this side, so I'm not going to worry too much about the belt here, but I want to really emphasize it back over here. So I'm going to go back in with my aquamarine again on the belt just to get it to pop out a little more, and I'm not going to use any of my green because I want it to look very different from the jacket color. Alright, at this stage I don't want to keep going back into it too many times or else it'll start to get too stainy and it might even start to look a little bit muddy. So let's take a look at this here from the front. So we have our beanie cap with the base layer and all of our shading and texture. We have her face, eye color, hair color. The jacket we've emphasized last time here with doing all of our little cast shadows inside of there. The buttons and the belt are a darker blue color. We're going to emphasize these even more later when we do color pencil. We have her hand in here. Everything looks nice and crisp. Then we have the charcoal skirt, her leg, and then of course moving down into a charcoal colored fishnet, as well as the glossy boots having the little straps on there, and everything is ready now for the glossy highlights. At this stage now we have all of the markers completed. We're ready to move into doing the color pencil, some mixed media, as well as ink.